take a look at these two types of cells, the bacterium on the right and the plant cell on the left. And I want you to notice, specifically looking inside those cells, any differences between them. Okay, what you should see is that the plant cell is much more complex than the bacterium. And this is a major difference between the two types of cells to which all organisms belong. In other words, all organisms have either eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. And you can see all the different groups of organisms alive on Earth grouped into either one of these two types of cells. So we're going to explore some of the differences between these two. Okay, prokaryotes are single-celled organisms, very simple organisms like these bacterial E. coli cells. What you see here is a whole group of individual organisms. Each one of these cells is its own individual organism, and you can see by the scale on the bottom right there, 1 micrometer, they're very, very small. Prokaryotic cells are surrounded by a couple of layers outside their cell membranes. One is a protective capsule on the outermost portion. This is made up of different proteins and sugars. And then just underneath that layer is a cell wall with a special kind of molecule called a peptidoglycan. Then prokaryotes, of course, like any cell, are surrounded by a plasma membrane. This is a phospholipid bilayer, just like the cells in you and I. All the contents that are inside the cell membrane are referred to as the cytoplasm. So this is often called a semi-fluid, gel-like matrix that includes both large molecules and the dissolved ions inside. Now, one of the hallmarks of eukaryotic cells is the presence of a nucleus, and prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. However, like the nucleus being a centralized region of the DNA, there is this thing called a nucleoid, which is just this portion of the prokaryotic cell that has all of the DNA stored at sort of a centralized location. And then the only other real feature of bacterial cells to note at this point are the occurrence of ribosomes. Ribosomes are where proteins are produced by the cell, and of course all living things need their proteins and the enzymes that help catalyze their reactions, so ribosomes are absolutely essential. And then finally, bacteria, prokaryotic cells may or may not have a large whip-like flagellum at the end. Now, one of the big things to note here is that prokaryotic cells are much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And they have no organelles, and we'll talk a little bit more about organelles in a moment. Okay, eukaryotic cells, as opposed to prokaryotic cells, are much larger and more complex. Now what you see here is a ciliate protist, and you can already tell from looking inside the cell there are many more complex structures than we just saw with the bacterial cell. However, this protist is one single-celled organism. Now, most eukaryotic organisms are multicellular and include all of the major groups of plants and animals and fungi that we normally think of every day. So, you and I, very complex, larger cells with more complexity. We're eukaryotes. Okay, and of course, in addition to the nucleus, there are a number of other organelles that are found inside of eukaryotic cells that make them different from prokaryotes. And we see here a few of these, like the mitochondrion, a chloroplast, the endoplasmic reticulum, and so on. Organelles, to define them, are these discrete structures inside the cytoplasm specialized for particular functions. So if we think back to the prokaryotic cell, the only thing that really came close to an organelle here were those ribosomes that are going to catalyze the production of proteins. Okay, so the first organelle we're going to look at is the nucleus, which is responsible for storing the DNA of the cell. Now, the nucleus is surrounded by a plasma membrane called the nuclear envelope. Again, this is just a phospholipid bilayer. However, there are two of these, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. That nuclear envelope has a number of nuclear pores inside it. These are just openings to allow the transfer of materials in and out of the nucleus. The DNA is kept in a loose form most of the time inside the nucleus, and that loose form is called chromatin. Now, below you see these 3 cells and the nuclei of these 3 cells. And notice that the one on the left looks a bit different. This is in the process of preparing for cell division and dividing its chromosomes. So what you see here is the condensed version of DNA called chromosomes. And you see how they look much different when they're tightened up than in their loose form of chromatin. And finally, the nucleolus, this central globular portion of the nucleus, is responsible for making ribosomes in particular. Again, those protein-producing organelles that are sent outside of the nucleus. Now, look for the Cell Part 3 video to continue on with learning about the organelles of a eukaryotic cell.